exhibit that's in our center gallery, Victor Hugo and French Romanticism, which is here courtesy of Michael and Laura Schlossberg, who are here this evening. Thank you very much for your generosity, your continued generosity to OU and to the museum, and sharing your amazing collection and your wealth of knowledge. I also want to just let you know that we have up at the front the rest of the lecture series and the concert series that's organized by Brent Reynolds. The next lecture will be with Dr. Jeffrey Collins on October 16th. It's Léger, Le Corbusier, Italian Futurists, Machines, and the Dynamic Cities. So mark your calendars. John Tilford.
I need to preface this talk by saying first and foremost that I was born and raised in rural middle Tennessee, and I am not a proficient French speaker, though I will try to do my best. As Elizabeth mentioned, I was educated for my master's degree in Great Britain, and I was a self-professed Anglophile for many years until I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. and Mrs. Schlossberg, who had very quickly turned me into a Frenchophile. And so I'm very happy to have this opportunity to work with this incredible collection, because as we all know, great museums are born out of great collections, and great collections are formed by great connoisseurs. And in Dr. and Mrs. Schlossberg, we have two remarkable connoisseurs here in Atlanta, Georgia. They have collected for decades. We are forever in their debt. They have given generously to the High Museum of Art, whose permanent collection has benefited from their generosity, as has Oglethorpe University Museum of Art. They presented a lovely drawing by Delaroche last year in honor of Lloyd Nick upon his retirement. The purpose of this particular lecture, however, will be to illustrate the multifaceted nature of the Romantic movement in 19th century France. We're going to pay special attention to the relationship between visual and pictorial arts. While Victor Hugo himself was a literary genius and truly defined the 19th century for France, he was also influenced by the Romantic painters of his day. One finds an especially close relationship between Hugo and the sculptor Delaroche. Their mutual support and admiration can be seen in numerous visual and literary sources throughout the 19th century. Victor Hugo was born on February 26, 18. While he was a law student, he would spend hours upon hours filling numerous sketchbooks with pictorial translations of classical scenes with clear graphic expression. Also during these early years, we see Hugo using schematic illustrations to solve experiments of physics and geometry. It is this spontaneous taste for geometric shapes which would later be utilized by Hugo to schematically outline works of literature. That is to say, before he would commit pen to paper, word to paper rather, he would draw out or sketch the scene he was trying to place into words. Hugo founded the review Conservateur Littéraire in 1819, and in that same year, his poetry references lithographs of famous battle scenes, such as General Legion's Vue de l'Attique, Vue de l'Attaque de Grand Convoy of 1819, now in the collections of Versailles and seen here. He was later influenced by the monumental battle scenes of Salvatore Rosa. Next slide, please. In 1814, the artist Ingres was commissioned by Napoleon's sister, Caroline Murat, Queen of Naples, to paint this work entitled Grand Odalisque. It's now in the collections of the Louvre. 5 years after it was painted, Ingres chose the painting to be exhibited in the Salon of 1819. We're going to use this term a lot throughout the talk, and when we say the Salon, we're actually referring to an annual exhibition at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, held from 1748 to 1890, and it was the definitive salon for French art in the 18th and 19th century. When Ingres' Odalisque was exhibited that year in 1819, this work was harshly perceived by critics, such as Charles Paul Landon, who described the work as primitive and compared it to contemporary troubadour poetry. Troubadour poetry was a revival from medieval times and often attached to the royalist movement of the day. So in other words, Landon's calling this work out of date, primitive, and royalist. However, when Hugo reviewed this particular painting, he was more sympathetic. He brought to mind the notion of Chinese painting, paying particular attention to the color, the nuance, and the mood of the work. In that same year of 1819, Hugo also praised the artist Jean Martin, whose work, next slide please, with its naturalistic tendencies, would eventually personify the Romantic movement for fellow artists. And in this rather rare work, we see Jean Martin portraying his fellow artist Eugene Delacroix. who was also another founding member of the Romantic Colorist movement. By 1825, Hugo writes his admiration for the lithographs published by Nodier in Voyages Picturesques et Romantiques dans l'Ancienne France. Similar medieval architectural images would later influence Hugo in his works such as Notre-Dame de Paris, otherwise known as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. In 1826, Hugo writes his first essay on romantic painting, though he would not publish it until 1834. And in this essay, Hugo insists that the critics of the Romantic painters failed to understand the historical inevitability of this revolution in the arts. 2 years after he wrote that essay, in 1828, Hugo included 2 notes in the dedication of 2 separate works. To the artist Boulanger, on the dedication of 2 ballads of Les Dieux, Alchez, à la Légende, and La Légende de la Nonne, and in 1829 to Vidanger, in a note added to Les Têtes de Serre for its publication Les Orientaux, Hugo paid tribute to both Boulanger and de Vidanger. However, he professed a sympathy between the different branches of the Romantic movement. However, he did not actually suggest at that time that any art needed to borrow from the specific resources of the other arts in order to achieve a revolution necessary in its own domain. By 1832, Hugo published an essay in Literature et Philosophie Malaise, in which he gives clear expression on his views for the essential relationship in literature between moral beauty and physical deformity by invoking certain symbolic figurations traditionally used in visual arts. So at that time, by 1832, Hugo is beginning to truly accept the interconnectedness between literature and fine art. Now, the ideals of French Romanticism painting especially, but also literature, owe a great debt to 16th and 17th century English history, with its ravages of civil war, regicide, murder of a monarch, and theater. Artists and writers of the Romantic movement could easily look to their English predecessors for rich sources of their ever-growing appetite for highly dramatic and visually stimulating subject matters. The revolution of 1789 was still too fresh in the minds of most French, and the regicide of Louis XVI, and even the downfall of Napoleon I, was far too familiar a thing to portray in print and on canvas. Next slide. Artists such as Eugène Delaroche and Paul Delaroche could turn to the England of the 16th century and 17th century for various pictorial examples of regicide. These artists would draw on such historical inspiration to create works such as this, Eugène Delaroche, La lecture de la sentence de Marie Stuart, painted in 1826, in which you're seeing the sentencing of Mary Queen of Scots being pronounced by the English court ordered by Elizabeth I. This isn't the execution at Fotheringay, this is the pronouncement of the sentence of death. And it's high theater, but again, it's not the actual moment of death. It's when the court, the tribunal, finds her guilty of treason for trying to assassinate Elizabeth I, and she's going to be condemned to death. The composition focuses on the drama of the moment in which characters take almost a secondary role in the painting. The architecture is every bit as important as the characters themselves. Next slide, please. However, when you look at the more classical style of Jacques-Louis David, Oath of the Herati, painted some decades earlier, you see an earlier academic classicism style in which there are clear focal points throughout the entire work. You're in a very disciplined, structured realm when you're looking at this painting. The background is completely secondary to the primary act in the foreground. This work, painted in 1784, is now in the Louvre. The Romantic painters recreated historical scenes into new ideals of theatrical illusion. And another example of this, next slide please, of French Romanticism borrowing from the 16th century English history is Paul Delaroche, Lady Jane Grey, painted in 1833. And for those of you who've been to the National Gallery in London, this is an enormous canvas, something like 8 by 12 feet tall. And when it was exhibited at the Salon, it was met with the greatest reviews. People loved this. The painting shows the moment just before the young pretender to the English throne is to be executed. Lady Jane Grey was niece to Henry VIII and cousin to King Edward VI. She was hurriedly placed on the throne upon Edward VI's death in 1553. The move was led by her father and other powerful Protestant men in Britain, who were anxious to usurp the would-be Catholic Queen Mary, later known as Bloody Mary, and sister of Edward VI. However, Queen Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, was, according to the last will and testament of her father, and by decree of Parliament, the legitimate heiress to Edward VI. Queen Mary's forces overtook London only days after Lady Jane was crowned queen, and eventually, under pressure from Philip II of Spain, whom she very much wanted to marry, Queen Mary signed the death warrant for Lady Jane Grey. She was executed on Tower Green in February of 1534 at the tender age of 16. And this work, again, was exhibited at the Salon in 1833. 2 years before this painting was exhibited, the same artist, Delaroche, turned to the 17th century for inspiration, namely the English Civil War. The subject matter was enormously relevant to a nation whose own monarch had been put to death within living memory. However, again, the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was still too fresh in the minds of many, so Delaroche looked toward the English king, Charles I. Here, painted in this iconic image of the triple portrait by Anthony van Dyck in 1635, the work was actually intended as a portrait study to be sent to the sculptor Bernini in Rome because the king could not travel to Italy. So instead, the greatest court painter in the 17th century created this painting, sent to Bernini. The bust was created. He was paid £800 and given an enormous diamond ring for the pleasure, for the commission. And Bernini loved the painting so much that he kept it, and his heirs retained it until 1822 when King George IV brought it back to the royal collection. 14 years after Van Dyck created this iconic image of King Charles, the king himself was put on trial in 1649. 10 days after that trial, he was executed outside the banqueting house of Whitehall. Next slide. As he was being led from the banqueting house at Whitehall onto the scaffolding of the second floor, this is the last thing he saw. These are 9 paintings depicting the apotheosis of King James I, his father. They were commissioned by Charles I, painted by Rubens, and they were installed in Whitehall in 1636. So in the apotheosis, you see King James I being led away from his earthly crown and placed with a heavenly crown upon his head. So this personifies the divine right of kingship. This is the last thing Charles I saw before he was dead. Yeah, it's pretty severe. And so here we see, next slide please, we see Delaroche depicting a scene shortly after what Charles I would have seen. The executed, decapitated Charles I being examined by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, if you won't focus on it's a little bit out of focus. Cromwell is inspecting, viewing the body of Charles I. And in 1827, 4 years before this painting was made, Victor Hugo wrote 400 pages of iambic pentameter entitled Cromwell. But in that work, he never touched on this scene. However, his colleague, Chateaubriand, in 1828, in his work, Les Quatre Stuarts, did give a depiction of this scene. And we think it's that scene by Chateaubriand that influenced and inspired Delaroche to paint this painting, which again was well received, but some people thought it went too far. It's a bit too much in your face, to say the least. Next slide, please. So here we have Eugene Delacroix's response to that painting, because I think he felt Delaroche was getting too much attention too soon, and that Delaroche was cashing in too quickly and made very beautiful pictures of bad subjects. And he felt that the scene should have been more severe and more grotesque. And so he drew this watercolor to show his friends this is what the painting should have looked like, but Delaroche didn't know how to paint it. He then wrote to his friend, fellow artist Paul Huet, and said in the letter, describing his watercolor, he, Cromwell, hesitates, he worries. Involuntarily, he takes off his hat and is fascinated by the spectacle of the denouement of this drama, which he has lived through, but doesn't know whether to go forward or backwards. Sadly, this watercolor by Delacroix is now lost. We only know the photographs. Next slide, please. But again, the fame of Delaroche's painting was such that you even had this caricature of Louis Napoleon, who would become Napoleon III, viewing the dead body of liberty, based on the Delaroche painting. So we've looked a lot at paintings, pictorial arts, but I'd now like to turn to three-dimensional works of art, and particularly the works of David d'Angers. David d'Angers was born the son of a woodcarver and sculptor. His father joined the revolutionary forces in the late 18th century. The artist was heavily influenced by the works of Jacques-Louis David, which we've seen earlier. David Donger's early drawings, in fact, were so influenced by Jacques-Louis David that often, even to this day, scholars are confused by the attribution, confusing David Donger's drawings with Jacques-Louis David. Next slide, please. And here we see David Donger with his great image of Liberty. Next slide, please. In 1811, David Donger won the Prix de Rome, which was a great artistic prize which would allow you the funding to travel to Rome and study, which was really the goal of all artists during this time. He won the Prix de Rome for his plaster relief entitled The Death of Epimanados after the Battle of Mantinea, seen here. The work is now in the collections of the Galerie David of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Angers. The work foreshadows the romantic artist's preference for compressed space and distorted bodies, a response against the harmony and balance of conventional neoclassicism. Note in the Oath of the Hierarchy, you saw that image constantly of three compositions, triple arches, three swords, three characters, this balance and harmony. And of course, with the Romantics, they wanted to challenge all of that. David Donger was always grounded in the revolution to which he was born. His father was a revolutionary prisoner held by the royalist general Longchamps, whose large-scale funerary sculpture was created by David Donger and exhibited in the Salon of 1824. Here, we see a reduced bronze cast of that same work from the collection of Dr. and Mrs. Schlossberg, which is currently on view at the Frick Museum in New York, which is staging a magnificent retrospective of the works of David Donger, which the Schlossbergs have contributed numerous works. But in this work, we see Longchamps calling out, and his last order as he lay dying was for his soldiers to spare the lives of the prisoners. Among those 5,000 revolutionary prisoners was the father of David Donger, whose life was spared by the final command from dying Longchamps, grâce aux prisonniers. This remarkable work owes some debt to antiquity, such as the modeling of the face of Longchamps, which is heavily influenced by earlier images from the antique of Alexander the Great. However, the overall composition is heavily indebted to an image of Iliossus by Phidias, which was included in the pedimental sculptures of the Parthenon. And in 1816, when David Donger was traveling to London, the pedimental marble sculptures of the Parthenon and the Panathenaic frieze around the Parthenon had been ripped off the wall and carted away by Lord Elgin and taken to England for the British. And they're now at the British Museum, where you can see them in that lovely setting. Next slide, please. Other examples of monumental sculpture include the artist's monument to Fenelon at the Cathedral of Cambrai. Here we see the first of 3 relief sculptures below the main effigy, which shows a scene in which Fenelon returns a lost cow to a poor family of peasants. This scene would later be adapted by Victor Hugo's character of Bishop Myriel in Les Miserables. By the year 1825, we see the death of General Maximilien Sebastian Foy, one of Napoleon's most admired generals. Shortly after his death, David Donger was commissioned to create the sculpture for the general's funerary monument shown here. Next slide, please. In one of 3 relief panels, we see the funeral procession of Foy, with 3 men carrying the general's coffin. And here, David Donger, as artist, takes artistic liberties to include Victor Hugo amongst the pallbearers, even though there is no exact definitive proof that Hugo actually attended the funeral. Next slide, please. That image of Hugo was based on this 1828 portrait medallion of Victor Hugo, here from the Schlossberg Collection, which they have graciously loaned to the exhibition here at Oglethorpe. Shortly after he began work on the monument of Foy, David Donger also began work on the pedimental sculptures of Sainte Genevieve, shown here, which would later become the Pantheon. Though the project was met with numerous interruptions and criticisms from the shifting government, the project was eventually completed in 1837. David Donger places the allegorical figure of Patria in the center. On her right sits Liberté, handing to her the crowns to be awarded to the great men. Opposite her, Histoire notes in the book of history the names of those thus distinguished, whereas she is surrounded by numerous people representing French cultural and intellectual history. The other side of the pediment is filled with French military figures. However, none of these military figures are shown with exacting portrait-like detail, with the exception of Napoleon Bonaparte. From the origins of revolution, David d'Angers would spend his entire life hoping to record the great men and women of his time. He produced at least 600 portrait medallions in his lifetime. Among the last at the time of his death was an image of Harry Beecher Stowe. The artist explained that his medals were rough drafts, they're sketches. They are like pamphlets for the people. Bas-reliefs are a form of writing. They are the archives of an era. You see why he and Hugo got along so well. But he cared little for personal fortune, and instead chose to remain pure to his art. He embraced technical advancements of his day, so his work might reach a larger audience at a lower cost. The greatest example is the collaboration with the engineer Achille Colas, who created a pantograph engraving technique in which a machine could mechanically translate the bas-relief of a medallion into a paper print or engraving. Colas also cast works in porcelain after original bronze medallions, such as this example, which is cast porcelain by the Sèvres factory after the bronze medal that we've just seen. This work also from the Schlossberg Collection, also graciously loaned to this exhibition here at Oglethorpe. Further proof of d'Angers' revolutionary spirit can be found in his statuette entitled Liberté. In 1848, the political clubs were preparing for the April elections. The clubs of the Union of Saint-Denis asked the artist for this particular statuette, for an example of this statuette, I should say. The preface to the request stated, "At the moment when liberty was not particularly popular, you made a statuette of liberty that awesomely resembles her mother, the Republic." This particular bronze example is also from the Schlossberg Collection and also on view at the Frick in New York as we speak. At the time of David d'Angers' death in 1856, the artist bequeathed his entire collection, drawings and plaster casts, to his hometown, where they are now preserved at the Galerie David of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Angers. Shortly after his death, his widow Emilie sought to publish her late husband's entire body of work in lithographic form, but this was an enormously costly endeavor, and she did it. She moved forward with it, but it was a great sacrifice, and we actually have letters between her and Madame Hugo where she's sympathizing, wanting to fulfill the legacy of her husband, but lamenting the financial pitfalls of it all. This relationship between the Hugo family and the David d'Angers family is further illustrated by a letter which Dr. Mrs. Schlossberg just acquired last week and is now hanging in the exhibition. We've just added it. But it's from David d'Angers to Victor Hugo, and I'm confident that Professor Lutz will help us in translating it tomorrow.
Already started.
By July of 1851, Hugo's opposition to Louis Bonaparte had hardened with his coining of the phrase, "We have had Napoleon the Great, now we have Napoleon the Small." After the coup d'etat of the 2nd of December, in which he tried in vain to oppose, and with Juliet's assistance, he fled the country to avoid arrest. First he went to Brussels. It was clear, however, that as a close neighbor of France, the Belgian authorities were concerned that Hugo's political statements would strain relationships between the two countries. And so in 1852, Hugo moved to Jersey, where there were already a number of proscribed opponents to the new French regime. In 1855, Queen Victoria visited Paris, which caused a highly satirical article to be published by the French exiles in a London newspaper. The contents were so horrific that some of Hugo's fellow proscribed in the newspaper they had founded in Jersey that led to them being expelled. He declared his own solidarity with this group of men and women, and suddenly it also led to his expulsion with his arrival in Guernsey in October. In 1856, he published Les Contemplations, a book of poetry which was an immediate success, and with the proceeds, he bought a home on the island known as Portrait House. Although legally able to return to France in 1859, Hugo was defiant and remained on the island until 1870. However, 2 years before his return from exile, the artist Ringel Dilzac visited the writer Hugo in exile and created I'm sorry, that's the letter that's just on. Let's go through it. This is an amazing cast gilded plaster medallion, a gilded plaster medallion by the artist Ringel Dilzac. And according to Dr. Schlossberg's research of many, many, many years, this is truly a unique work of art that has never been duplicated in any way, shape, or form. It is inscribed on the reverse, To Dorian, in memory of our half-century of our lively friendship, 3rd of September 1868. Miniat. Miniat offered the medallion to Louise Aline Menin Dorian, who held a literary salon on the Rue de la Faisanderie. Her daughter Pauline Menin Dorian married George Hugo, grandson of Victor Hugo. And with that, the medallion remained in the Hugo family until the year 2012, when it was acquired at auction by Dr. Schlossberg. And this work is now included in the exhibition here at Oglethorpe today, for which we are very interested. During the decade of his return to France, we see Hugo once again present in continued criticisms of Napoleon III. The work to the left is an original drawing in which Hugo is branding Napoleon III as a criminal. At the time this drawing entered the exhibition, we did not know the artist, we did not know a date. Later research proved that it was used as the frontispiece for the journal Depicting in March. I'm sorry?
John.
Well, yeah, I like to sleuth, I like to roll the chase, I like to find things that are hard to find. But we now know that this drawing was published by Alfred Le Petit, who was also the artist of the drawing, who founded the journal Depicting. It was published on March 24, 1878. Petard had a strong voice of criticism against Napoleon III. And there are slight revisions. Only one of the 3 works of literature by Hugo are actually printed in the final state of the composition. And Elizabeth Peterson has kindly suggested that this is probably due to a printing necessity, because it's a smaller sheet of paper and you want the words to be as powerful as possible. By the time of Hugo's death in 1885, he had achieved an undeniable legendary status. His final days were recorded in the greatest of detail by the Parisian press. And so, when he breathed his last breath, there were still further efforts made to promote the continued fame of Victor Hugo. During a 36-hour period, numerous artists were summoned to the Hugo home to capture one final image of Hugo on his deathbed. Among the first to arrive was Gaspard Félix Tonachon, known as Nadar, who captured an iconic image of Hugo on his deathbed. Other artists, such as Emile Jules Dalou, who had only recently been introduced to Hugo by Rodin, was there to capture the death mask. And here we have the artist Frédéric Hunter Camera, who we think was one of the last of the artists to arrive in the house, because it's the last day of that 36-hour period. And he captured this beautifully sympathetic sketch of Hugo on his deathbed. And this also is from the Schlossberg Collection and very kindly loaned to the exhibition. But it's extraordinarily rare, because the death mask can be cast again and again. The photograph by Nadar can be printed again and again, but this is a truly unique work of art. Shortly after Hugo's death, the government proposed a monument that should be erected to Hugo's memory in the Pantheon. Rodin, who had recently sketched Hugo in his final years, was the obvious candidate. However, Rodin had also recently introduced Hugo to his fellow sculptor, Emile Dalou. The younger Dalou was supposed to have visited Hugo to sketch the man, but given his declining health, he found himself creating the death mask. So there's this call by the government to create an appropriate monument to Hugo. And Rodin thought it should have been his. Rodin had created a bust of Hugo, which he exhibited in 1883. Hugo didn't like the bust. He still allowed Rodin to introduce him to Dalou. So Dalou came in, and then Dalou ends up creating the death mask. So then when Hugo's dead, these two artists are furious with each other because they both want the great funerary monument to Victor Hugo. And Rodin was furious with Dalou. He thought Dalou had usurped him and overstepped all sorts of bounds. But in the end, the French government gave the commission to Rodin. However, Rodin could never quite wrap his head around the idea of how to portray Victor Hugo. So 19 years on, the project was never realized. Rodin died without ever completing the project to Victor Hugo. However, next slide. We do have Jean Boucher, who was commissioned to create a second memorial sculpture to Hugo, which was to be a monumental work to be given to the people of Guernsey for their hospitality shown to Hugo for so many years. This work was created between 1913 and 1914. The French government paid 30,000 francs to Jean Boucher to create it. The primary monumental sculpture itself was sent to Guernsey, but this is an extraordinarily rare cast of the bust of Hugo drawn from that larger sculpture, and this too is from the Schlossberg Collection, which they generously loaned into the exhibition. So it's worth noting in the end that Rodin, again, Hugo didn't like, never got the commission. And in 1885, the French government, immediately after Hugo died, passed an emergency decree to once again deconsecrate Sainte-Geneviève Church. It had been consecrated, deconsecrated at least 3 or 4 times. Voltaire and Rousseau's ashes had been taken in and out and in and out. And finally, in 1885, the French government saw the perfect opportunity to once and for all deconsecrate Sainte-Geneviève and to create a civil monument to the great men and women of France. And so this was done, and Hugo was laid to rest in the Pantheon. And so, again, Rodin didn't get the commission for the sculpture, but the pedamental sculpture over the Pantheon was created many decades before by his great friend Delaroche. And I think Hugo would have loved that. And I think in the end, Hugo had the last laugh, and he certainly had the last word. Thank you. I think we have time for questions if anyone would like to ask. I'll try my best to answer. Yes, Jay.
Your lecture gave a nice description of the change somewhat in political position of Hugo and artists throughout the 19th century, because in the early part, by depicting all of those regicides, and that's clearly a more conservative position.
Yes.
Then becomes almost exactly the opposite by the end of his life. I was just wondering, were you aware of this interest in the English regicides before doing research?
Because I was able to spend a lot of time in England, I was familiar with the works of Delaroche and others, which obviously were very well received by British clientele, and that's one reason you have a lot of those great works ending up in British collections, like Lady Jane Grey, the Children of King Edward, a much smaller cabinet painting of the boys who were put to death in the Tower. That's in the Wallace collection just down the street in London. Yes?
2 years ago, the Louvre had an exhibition on Delaroche, and they actually borrowed the Death of Lady Jane Grey, which is a masterpiece. And Monsieur Proust put that together.
But I love what that painting did to the salon, to the art scene in Paris in the 1830s. I love the response because it was building on a literary foundation, but then at the same time you had artists like Delacroix who really didn't like it. And later in Delacroix's life, he was given what someone thought was a great compliment when the principal librarian of the Louvre compared Delacroix's work to the literary oeuvre of Hugo. And it enraged Delacroix. And Delacroix yelled out, "I am not a romantic, I am a classicist." So he was really turning his back on his earlier years. Yes?
You made it clear that Delaroche was a good friend of the Hugo family. Were there other, and I know that there were many artists who portrayed him, were there others who were that close to the Hugo family?
I don't know yet, and I think this is an area of research that needs a lot more attention.
Miguel,
Yes,
close
thank you,
friend?
sir.
Oh yeah, they were. David Angers, members of the Hugo family, Adele, which I mentioned, came close to buying, but Miguel.
There's a wonderful film by Francois Truffaut, Adele, the story of Adele, library, Delaroche.
But yes, I would like to look more at this relationship of romantic writers and painters pictures, and I think there's a lot more to be done there. It's rich resource material for research.
They work with salons.
Yes.
Salons, George Sand, for example, had salons. Many of the writers and artists were there. The arts, Delaroche, Jay, many. There was an exhibition of that also, it was quite interesting a few years ago. They had a catalog, Musée de Romantique, the Irish chef